What if you bought a beautiful old home only to discover that somebody else believed it still belonged to them? Someone who had lived there decades before. Someone who occasionally appeared inside the house, even after she was dead. Today, we're traveling north here in Illinois to Rockford. And we're going to go to a house that stood for more than a century and a half. A strange, beautiful Victorian era home near the Rock River. A house sometimes referred to as the riverboat Gothic. And according to generations of local stories, there may be a woman who never completely left it. A woman some people simply call the Lady Ghost. Welcome back to Small Town Big Talk, Galesburg, Illinois. This is Kristen, and today we're digging into another piece of Illinois history where documented facts and local folklore become tangled together. And I'm telling you right now, this one has all the ingredients I love. An incredibly old house, a mysterious woman, dogs heard walking through empty rooms, knocking with nobody on the other side. A figure appearing inside the home. And possibly one of the creepiest phone calls in Rockford ghost story history. Because according to legend, after seeing an elderly woman inside the house, someone called the nursing home where she supposedly lived, only to be told she couldn't have been there because she had already died. So get comfortable, turn the lights down, and if you're brave enough, today we're talking about Rockford's Lady Ghost. Let's get into it. Before we get into ghosts, we have to talk about the house itself. Because whether or not you believe in spirits, this building is genuinely historic. The house associated with the story stands on North 1st Street in Rockford, Illinois, not far from the Rock River. And if you've seen a photograph of it, you understand immediately why people remember it. It doesn't look like a plain little house. This thing has personality. Tall windows, rounded arches, an unusual tower rising above the center, decorative roof lines, bay windows extending from the front, and an appearance that almost makes the house look like something you'd expect to see overlooking the Mississippi River in an old Southern Gothic movie. That's apparently where the nickname Riverboat Gothic came from. And according to an old newspaper clipping about the property, the home was built around 1856. Think about that date for a second. 1856. That means this house existed before Civil War. Abraham Lincoln was not yet president. Illinois looked dramatically different. Rockford itself had only recently become an incorporated city. Railroads were transforming northern Illinois. Horse-drawn wagons traveled the streets. There weren't any cars, no electric lights glowing through the windows, no television, no phone, no internet. At night, much of this area would have become almost completely dark. Just imagine standing outside that house on an 1850s winter night, snow covering the ground. Maybe an oil lamp glowing behind one upstairs window. The Rock River nearby, the wind moving through bare trees, and nothing but darkness beyond the edges of town. That's the world this house came from. According to historic newspaper information connected to the house, one of its earliest owners was a man named George Dennett. Historical records do show that a George H. Dennett arriving in Rockford, he moved there in 1855. The clipping says he came from New Hampshire and established a dry goods business. That makes sense for Rockford during this period. The 1850s were a boom era for the city, and the railroad had arrived. Businesses were growing, new homes were going up, and Rockford's population was rapidly increasing. People were arriving from eastern states looking for opportunity. So imagine George Dennett arriving in this young Illinois city. He builds or acquires this striking home. Families live there. Children may have run through the rooms. Meals were cooked. Visitors came through the front door. Birthdays happened. Arguments happened. People became sick. People grew old. And people died. And generation after generation passed through these rooms. This is one thing I think we forget when looking at historic houses. We see architecture. But a house that is 150 or 170 years old has absorbed an unbelievable amount of human life. Think about your own home. Think about everything that has happened inside of it during the last 5 or 10 years. Now multiply that across 16 or 17 decades. That's a lot of history sitting behind those walls. And eventually, stories about something unusual happening inside this particular home begin circulating. Okay, so this is where history begins blending into legend. Later Rockford ghost stories identify an elderly woman named Emma Jones as the spirit connected to a large old house on North First Street. According to those stories, Emma lived there with her husband, Frank Jones, around the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Frank reportedly worked in transportation and frequently traveled, and here's one of the most haunting images from the entire legend. Emma supposedly spent long stretches of time sitting near an upper window of the house, watching toward the Rock River, waiting for Frank to return, and she wasn't alone. Emma reportedly loved 2 dogs. So picture this scene. An elderly Victorian-era woman, 2 dogs beside her, sitting quietly near an upstairs window, looking toward the river, waiting day after day for her husband to come home. There's something almost sad about that before anything paranormal even enters the story, because eventually, according to the legend, Frank died. Then Emma's beloved dogs died, and Emma began struggling mentally. Stories say her health deteriorated and she eventually had to leave her beloved home and enter a care facility. For Emma, that apparently wasn't just moving out of a building. That house was her home, and it contained her memories, her husband, her dogs, her life. And according to local legend, Emma never really accepted that it wasn't hers anymore. Imagine buying this beautiful, historic Rockford house, and you're excited. Maybe you're wanting to restore it. Maybe you're moving furniture into a front parlor and neighbors tell you something strange. They occasionally see an elderly woman wandering around the property. Nothing supernatural yet, because Emma was still reportedly alive at the time. The explanation was that she had become confused. She remembered the house, so sometimes she apparently tried to return, and honestly, that is heartbreaking in my opinion. Imagine having spent decades somewhere and then suddenly not understanding why strangers are inside the place you still believe is your home. But then the story gets much stranger. One version of the legend tells of new residents entering their front room one day and discovering an elderly woman standing there. Not outside, not looking through a window, inside their house. And she wasn't happy. According to the story, the elderly woman basically demanded to know what these people were doing in her house. The residents were stunned, and then reportedly walked past them and disappeared out the front door. Now, at first they didn't necessarily think ghost. Remember, neighbors had already told them about Emma. So their reaction supposedly wasn't, "We just seen a dead woman." It was, "Emma wandered away from the nursing home again." They contacted the facility. And that's where this legend becomes one of those stories that gives you chills. Because according to the Rockford retelling, the person at the nursing home told them that couldn't possibly have been Emma. Emma hadn't escaped. Emma hadn't wandered away. She was dead. She'd reportedly died weeks earlier. Now, I want you to actually imagine being the person on that phone. You just watched an elderly woman walk through your living room. You heard her speak. She recognized the house. She was angry you were there. And minutes later, someone tells you that woman has been dead for weeks. I don't know about you, but I'd suddenly be looking at every room in that house differently. Emma apparently wasn't the only presence people claimed remained behind. Remember those two dogs she loved? Yeah. Later residents reportedly described hearing what sounded like dogs' claws clicking across the hardwood floors. Anybody who has ever had a dog knows exactly that sound. Nails tapping against the wood as an animal walks down a hallway. Except imagine hearing that when you don't have dogs. You're sitting downstairs at night. The house is quiet. And then somewhere above you, dog nails clicking on hardwood. You stop what you're doing. The noise stops. Maybe you convince yourself it's the house settling. Old houses do make noise. Pipes knock. Wood expands. Floorboards creak. Perfectly normal. Then it begins again. Moving across the floor. If the stories are true, residents associated those mysterious sounds with Emma's beloved animals. And honestly, of all the things in the story, that one almost makes me feel sad rather than scared. If you believe the legend, Emma waited in that house with those dogs for the person she loved. Then one by one, she lost everything. Maybe the legend survived because there's something deeply human underneath it. Someone longing for home. Someone refusing to leave this place where their happiest memories existed. Now we go downstairs, because what would an old haunted house story be without a creepy basement? One reported encounter involves a realtor who was inside the house, and according to the story, while realtor was in the dark basement, an elderly woman suddenly appeared nearby. Think about the basement of a house built in the mid-1800s. Low lighting, stone or old brick, mechanical equipment added generations after the house was built. Odd little corners, shadows, maybe tiny windows near the ceiling. We don't know. Even in broad daylight, old basements could feel creepy. Now picture standing down there, alone, turning around, and seeing a woman who wasn't there a moment earlier. And not a shadow, not movement out of the corner of your eye. A person, an elderly person. There are rational explanations people will offer for paranormal encounters, such as lighting, stress, expectation, reflections, memory. The human brain trying to recognize faces and figures in random shapes, and those possibilities deserve to be considered. But when the stories start coming from different people across different periods, that's when folklore begins growing around a location. And before long, the house isn't simply old anymore. It's haunted. Other residents reportedly heard unexplained knocking. Imagine hearing that upstairs when everyone is downstairs, or coming from inside a wall. You investigate. Nothing. Then later, a knock. Again. Old houses absolutely make noises. Let's be fair. Plumbing, heating systems, wood expanding, tree branches, animals, wind. A 19th century house doesn't sit silently. But when people already know a ghost story connected to their home, those noises can take on an entirely different meaning. A pipe isn't just a pipe anymore. A floorboard isn't just a floorboard. And a knock isn't necessarily just the house settling. Every strange sound raises one question. Emma? Now, whether you personally believe in ghosts or not, there's an interesting pattern in paranormal folklore. Ghost stories frequently involved attachment. Someone dies suddenly. Someone loses a loved one. Someone experiences tragedy or refuses to leave their home. Someone returns to a place that mattered tremendously to them. And that's how Emma Jones' story is told. She isn't describing as some evil demon hiding in the attic. She isn't chasing people with an axe. She isn't some monster. She's basically portrayed as an old, confused woman trying to go back home. And that makes this story completely different from many haunted house legends. If Emma existed exactly as the folklore describes her, maybe she wasn't trying to frighten anyone. Maybe she simply couldn't understand why strangers were living in her house. Think about the alleged encounter where she demanded to know why people were there. That's not get out or I'll hurt you. It's more like, why are you in my house? Which, from Emma's perspective, might have been a perfectly reasonable question. I also want to put this house into perspective geographically. Now, Rockford grew around the Rock River. By the 1850s, the city was changing rapidly. The railroad helped connect Rockford with Chicago and the larger region. Factories and businesses expanded, bridges crossed the river, the population increased dramatically, and houses like this one represented prosperity and permanence. There's actually an extraordinary surviving photograph of Rockford from 1853 that is only about 3 years before the reported construction date of the riverboat Gothic house. When you look at that photograph, you realize just how young Rockford was. This wasn't a giant modern city. This was a growing 19th century community divided by a river. So when the house went up around 1856, it would have been impressive. And then the world changed around it. The Civil War came and went. Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. Electricity arrived. Cars replaced horses. Airplanes crossed the sky. 2 world wars happened. Television arrived. Humans landed on the moon. I mean, the internet appeared. Smartphones became normal. And through all of that, the house remained standing, which means if walls could really remember, those walls would have a lot to say. Now, here's where I want to separate history from ghost stories, because I love paranormal stories, but I don't want to tell you something is proven when it isn't. The existence of the house, yes. The historic North First Street location, yes. 19th century origins, supported by old local information. George H. Dennett being in Rockford beginning around 1855, yes. Historical records support that. The paranormal experiences, those are stories, local folklore. Eyewitness accounts and retelling passed from owner to owner, neighbor to neighbor, and eventually onto paranormal websites and Rockford media. We can't prove from those stories that Emma Jones's ghost walked through the house. We can't prove ghost dogs crossed the floor. And we cannot scientifically prove that an apparition appeared in the basement. But here's what I find fascinating. You don't necessarily need to prove the paranormal part to appreciate the story, because folklore itself becomes history. The fact that generations of people remember the story means something. Something about that house, that woman, or the people who live there made enough of an impression that people kept talking, and we're still talking about it today. Let's play skeptic for a minute. If someone saw an old woman inside a house, maybe Emma really was still alive during an earlier version of the story, and somewhere along the way, the timeline got changed. Stories evolve. People tell someone. That person tells another person. And 20 years later, details become sharper, scarier, and more dramatic. Dog claws? Old wood contracting, rodents, tree branches, heating systems, knocking, pipes, expansion, wind, a woman in the basement? All possible. But then we have the paranormal believers argument. Why do several different stories center around the same kind of woman? Why did residents associate sounds with dogs? Why did the house develop a reputation in the first place? And most importantly, what happened that caused somebody to write an actual newspaper story with the headline, "Rockford's Lady Ghost Surfaces Again"? That word is interesting. again. Not Rockford family thinks house might be haunted. Not strange noise heard. The lady ghost surfaces again. That suggests the legend was already established by the time that article had appeared, which means whatever started this story may go back considerably further. This is actually how I came across this story. I saw an old newspaper clipping showing the house. On one side, an old black and white photograph. On the other was a more modern photograph showing that the building survived. And across the article, big letters, Rockford's Lady Ghost surfaces again. Now tell me, you're scrolling past that headline. I'm not. Absolutely not. I'm stopping. Because there are certain newspaper headlines where you immediately think, okay, what happened in that house? The clipping describes the building as one of the city's older homes and refers to its distinctive architecture, but whoever wrote that article wasn't simply interested in architectural preservation. The reason the house made the newspaper was the ghost. And decades later, people in Rockford are still discussing haunted locations, including North First Street. That's how the local legend survived. One clipping. One neighbor's story, one person who says, my grandmother knew someone that used to live there. I love when they start saying that. Then another generation hears it. And suddenly a woman who lived more than a century ago still has people saying her name. There's another way to look at this story. And maybe the reason the Emma Jones legend resonates isn't because it's scary. Maybe it's because it's about loss. According to the story, Emma loved her husband. She loved her dogs. She loved that house. And then she lost her husband, her animals, and lost her health. And finally, she lost her home. Imagine being elderly and confused, but still remembering one thing clearly: home. So you go back, except people you don't know answer the door, and they tell you it isn't yours anymore. Maybe you're taken back to the nursing home, and again, you remember home. So you return, then eventually you die. And according to the legend, you still return. There's something incredibly sad about that to me. If I ever encountered Emma in that house, assuming for a moment ghosts are real, I don't know what my first reaction would be. Probably fear. All right, let me correct that. My first reaction would absolutely be fear. I'd probably be halfway to Wisconsin, but afterward, I'd feel sorry for her. Because a legend doesn't sound like a monster. It sounds like someone who couldn't let go of the only place that still felt like hers. Here's another interesting part of the modern version of the story. Some reports suggest the activity eventually became quieter. Later owners apparently cared for and restored the home, and paranormal storytellers have suggested, romantically at least, that maybe Emma finally realized the house was being loved again. And maybe she didn't need to guard it anymore. Maybe she moved on, but of course, we can't know that. I actually like that ending, though. After all the creepy knocking, all the footsteps, all the appearances, maybe the lady ghost finally found peace. Although, I'm going to say something. If I bought that house, the first night I'm sleeping there and I hear dogs' claws on the floor, we're having a conversation. I'm turning the lights on and I'm saying, Emma, girl, you can stay, but we're going to need some ground rules because I'm not waking up at 3 o'clock every morning wondering who's walking through my hallway. So now I want to know what you would do. Imagine you're given this house for free. Beautiful, historic home, incredible architecture, almost 170 years of history. But there's one condition. You have to live there for 1 full year. And you're told beforehand, people have reportedly seen an elderly woman inside. People have heard dogs walking when there are no dogs around. People have heard unexplained knocking. And previous residents believe the woman may be Emma. Now, are you taking the house? Or are you saying, nope, Emma can have it? Because I'm telling you right now, A free historic house is tempting, very tempting. But the first time somebody I didn't invite walks through my living room and disappears, that house is going to be back on Zillow by breakfast. That leaves us with the question every paranormal story eventually comes down to. Do you believe it? Was Emma Jones really haunting an old house along First North Street? Did people really hear her dogs walking across the floors? Was an elderly woman actually seen after her death? Or did ordinary sounds, local gossip, I can't even talk today, local gossip, a genuinely creepy old house, and decades of storytelling combined to create one of Rockford's enduring ghost legends? Maybe we'll never know, but tonight, somewhere in Rockford, that old house still stands. Cars pass it. People walk nearby. The Rock River keeps moving. Modern life continues all around it. But behind those tall windows are rooms that existed when America looked completely different. Rooms where generations lived and died. And maybe, just maybe, when everything becomes quiet and the lights go out, someone still remembers when that house was hers. And that is the story of Rockford's mysterious lady ghost and the old riverboat Gothic house. If you've ever lived in Rockford, if you know more about this house, if somebody in your family remembers the lady ghost story, or even better, if you or someone you know has ever experienced something strange there, please, I want to hear from you. Because sometimes the best pieces of local history aren't sitting in a museum. They're sitting in somebody's grandmother's photo album. They're buried in old newspapers. They're stories families have been telling at the dinner table for 50 years plus. And those are exactly the stories I love digging into. So drop your stories in the comments, please, and tell me this too. Do you think Emma was really still trying to come home? And would you spend one night alone inside that house? Thank you for hanging out with me for another episode of Small Town Big Talk, Galesburg, Illinois. If you enjoyed this story, share the episode with somebody who loves local history, mysteries, and things that go bump in the night. Till next time, remember, every small town has a story. Sometimes the people in those stories are still around. Good night, everybody.